So again, on a kind of a Thanksgiving theme, I drove by the courthouse here in town the other day, and I remembered that it was 2 or 3 years ago that I was summoned for jury duty. And when I am, I always show up, even as many of my friends have never done it, most of them. And I actually shouldn't judge them about it because for them it was work related. And I've never had a job that I wouldn't trade for a corn dog, much less jury duty. But I just think as citizens, there's not much asked of us, so showing up for jury duty shouldn't be a big deal. And often the cases are dismissed before you even get there. And if you do have to sit through it, I've served on a couple juries. There's always something interesting about them, just like there is about the jurors. So, they gather the 50 of us or whatever it is. And, I don't know all the details, but it was basically a he said, she said rape case. And of course, there was alcohol involved, but I was disappointed. I was hoping for something more in my wheelhouse, like a drug bust. So the prosecutor was this very prim, humorless woman, call her Miss James, who looked like she'd come over on the Mayflower. And she would call us up one at a time to the microphone to quiz us. And the questions were basically on the line of, do you drink alcohol? How often do you drink it? How much do you drink? Have you ever had a blackout? And then I thought, now we're cooking. Now we're cooking. Because, I consider myself I'm an expert on this subject, and was even kind of fond of blackouts, unless you were a woman, which, it's obviously not recommended if you are. And it surprised me when she would ask people, they'd say, if you had a blackout, they say, well, I've never had one, or I had one in college and it so horrified me that, I never drank that much again. And it reminded me of the old AA days when, these old seasoned rummies, few of them had blackouts. Most of them had never had the DTs. And I always thought, am I in the wrong gang? Is there a wino anonymous? And finally, my number is called, and I go up there, and, Miss James is checking me out. And she had that, that schoolmarm vibe to her. And she said, well, number 26, what do you do? And I said, well, I grew and sold pot for 30 years, and now I write and illustrate memoirs. And she said, oh, would I have read them? I said, absolutely not. But I turned to the jurors behind me. I said, if any of you are interested, my first one is called High and Dry, and it's on Amazon, which it isn't anymore, by the way.
It's on Hell's Press now,
Yeah,
right?
and they sort of snickered, and I turned back to her, and she was obviously not amused, and she said, so you're a drinker then, number 26? I said, well, I was years ago, but I've quit for a long time. And she said, did you ever have a blackout? And I said, yeah, I'd say at least 400 to 500 of them. Probably on the high end of that, because I said, it's not like winos keep score. And she said, well, how do you feel about that? How did you know that you'd done something and the next day you didn't even know what it was? That must have been terrible. And I said, the only time I ever regretted blackouts was when I was in the DTs. Because when you're in the delirium tremens, it's so scary and so awful.
that you want to know every second of everything that got you there. But I said, other than that, I kind of like blackouts. And she said, you liked blackouts? And I said, yeah, I said, I never raped or killed anyone, as far as I know. And I said, think about it, it's fascinating. You're walking around, you're basically unconscious, your recorder is off, you have no inhibitions. And I said, if that isn't the real you, who the hell is? And she said, well, what did you think when you met the real you? I said, how would I know? I never met the guy. I heard stories about him. I don't know. So, when she was done, I sat down, and the defense attorney, all through the rest of the interrogations, after he'd question a juror, he'd wrap up with, do you, like Mr. Memoir writer over there, think blackouts are funny? And so we come back the next day, and, she has 4 peremptory challenges. And the judge says to her, well, Miss James, you can, and she jumps up and says, number 26, you're out of here. And, I was so relieved. It's like that old-time draft physical. You've done your duty, you show up, and they don't want your ass anyway. It's the best of all possible worlds. So I stood up, waved to everybody, wished them a happy Thanksgiving, and I was halfway to the door when this other juror grabbed me. And he was this real shaky guy who described himself the day before as a philosopher. And he said, hey, Stretch, what's the name of that book of yours? And I told him I knew he'd like it. You could smell the gin on the guy.